I may have messed this up today because I read chapters 43 to 46 of Isaiah. It didn't seem like there was much to go, so I just jot it down. And then when I was thinking about what I'm going to say about it, like, actually there's some massive ideas in there, so we're going to try and fly through them, jam all these in and do it efficiently. So we've got Isaiah relaying a message from God, and the message is, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. And there's my first problem, this whole idea of redeeming. It's like, okay, that's interesting. We'll come back to that. And then God states that he loves you, which is really nice. I don't think it's you, I think it's Israel in this context. But I guess on the basis that everything opened up to everybody, then I guess it would include you. So there we go. It's just nice, I think, when we do have this softer language, because there's so much doom and gloom. And don't get me wrong, it's the Israelites bringing it on themselves. There's no question of that. But it is nice when God does say these nicer things, I think. It's just like, okay, that's what we're aiming for. God also says, I will give people in exchange for you, nations for your life. Well, I mean, that sounds a little bit like the idea of substitution creeping in, which I suppose we have seen before when it was the scapegoat. When was that? Was that Numbers? Or maybe Deuteronomy? One of those. And yeah, so you had the sins put onto the goat and the goat sent off into the desert. And suddenly now this idea that people are taking the exchange of something, and then you've got the Israelites talking about being redeemed, and you think of redeeming meaning to take possession of something, so God taking possession of his people or something, but they haven't seemed to have done anything yet. So at this point we're still during the reign of Hezekiah and all that lot, so we're very much in the decline phase of the Israelites. So he's talking future, it sounds like, during the Babylonian exile. And there seems to be some sort of redemption there in the sense that some of the Israelites are allowed back into Jerusalem to rebuild it, which talks about a bit more in here. But it's not clear that the Israelites actually did anything to deserve that. Almost seems like the slate is clear because they've been kicked out, they've had their punishment, it resets the score and then go back. So I think that idea is new. Maybe it's getting a bit more New Testament-y, I suppose, than it is, but it's an interesting idea, but I guess we're sort of, to some extent, Isaiah is paving the way for the New Testament, or at least that seems to be the intention. But yeah, some tricky ideas. God also, very handily, if you say, okay, what are people for? God gives the answer, it's for my glory. Yeah, the things you can say when you're God that you can't when you're human. It's a really interesting one. That occurred to me that people have kids, and you wouldn't say that of your kid. Is that? No, that might not be right, actually. You get some people who they're absolutely compelled. I must have children because I must pass on my seed, and this is my right to do this. I'm programmed to do this, and it must be done. And whose whole family lineage is really high esteem, that sort of thing. I personally don't care at all about that sort of thing, actually. But you can see where someone who does, there's a sense of potentially having a child for having your glory, to some extent, I suppose. So my point there was going to be that that's a very different way of speaking. A human you wouldn't have a pet or a child for your glory. But actually in that context, some people might actually have children for their own glory to some extent. I think that's probably not the right attitude to take or like not the right reason for having children, I would say. For me personally, it's a case of, you get to a sort of point in life and you think actually you could probably do quite a good job of looking after someone. Whether that's actually true or not is another matter entirely. But it's rewarding to take that responsibility for caring for something. At least from a man perspective. I guess it's probably quite different from a woman perspective, and I'm not qualified to talk on that. So yeah, but I mean, it's anything but having a child for my glory. It's almost the opposite of that. So in my head, it sort of helps clarify the idea that God wouldn't create people for his glory in the same way we would have children for our glory. So God is very different, therefore we need to think about God not in human terms, and that's really difficult. That was a really long way of getting to my point, wasn't it? These ideas are just so massive though, and having to tangle with them and try and fit them into a very short video, it's very, very difficult. From here anyway, it's been largely positive in this section so far, but it starts to sort of almost turn. And God mentions here that he's become weary of the Israelites because of their burdening him with his sin, with their sin. And it occurred, this is one of those things, just write it down, move on. And then it suddenly occurred, it's like, well, you can't be weary. Wearisome is something that occurs over time, isn't it? And this ties for me back to this whole idea that logically, for God to have created the universe, he must have created time. Therefore, he must be outside of time. Therefore, he's not subject to time. Therefore, he can't be sort of chipped away at in that way that anything does that makes you weary. So it raises the question, is that just Isaiah taking an idea, he's had a dream from God showing God is weary, and the best word that Isaiah can come up with to describe it is weariness, even though logically weariness wouldn't fit for a sensation of God. I suppose it's useful in the sense that it helps us relate to how he's feeling, but at the same time it doesn't help when you're trying to separate how God would approach something and how we would approach something. Not to say that we can get our minds around how God would approach it, but because it's hard enough to get our heads around the fact that God won't be anything like us. I'm thinking about this in advance, I suppose, for the Trinity to some extent, and trying to wrap my head around what the Trinity would be. I realise that's some way off, but we're doing lots of bits at the same time. And the Trinity makes no sense in human capacity because you can't even come up with a concept or an example to illustrate how that would make sense, having three beings in one. But if you remove the concept of trying to make God feel like a bloke, he won't have gender, he's not a bloke on a cloud with a beard. It's a completely alien concept of being to humanity. Then it seems like that could be the key to trying to get your head around that. And the Bible almost doesn't do you any favours when it talks about God becoming weary, because that makes him sound like he's like us, is my point there. Some long-winded points today. We then anyway have another nice simple phrase that comes up with a massive idea, and he talks about God is saying that he blots out your transgressions, and then he does it for his own sake. It's not to say the sin is removed or the transgressions are removed, they're just sort of smudged over. And he does it for his own sake, which is really interesting. And you tie that to the idea of weariness, and it makes you wonder, is God actually hurt by our transgressions and sin? Potentially. I don't know if that's what that's saying, or is that reading far too much into it? I just don't know. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? I mean, you think in human terms, to forgive someone is actually a sort of a selfish thing, because you're letting go of it. So if you hold a grudge, it hurts you, it doesn't hurt them. It might even please them that you hold a grudge against them. But if you let go of it, you benefit. So forgiveness is sort of selfish, but that's not going to work in God terms, surely. That God is hurt by our transgressions, so if he forgives us, it's better for him. It does almost feel like sin is something tangible that messes things up and actually causes him problem, or something like that. Don't know. Don't think there's enough information there really to figure that out, so it's an idea we'll keep in mind. God also goes on then to be very specific that he is the first and the last, and that there are no other gods. I quite like that, because some of the language earlier on was a little ambiguous, and I talk about no other gods before me. It does sound like, well, does that sort of suggest that other gods exist? I think that would be a slightly obtuse reading of it, perhaps, to some extent. But it does raise the question. And then tied to that, God goes on to talk about, it's quite a long section, I thought it was quite funny, but he's talking about basically what muppets people are, that they make themselves idols and then worship them, despite the fact they know what they just made it out of a log or something. And that throws back to, is it Exodus, the golden calf? I mentioned the video then. There's this weird situation where Moses goes up Mount Sinai for 40 days and the people get all a bit twitchy. So they said to Aaron, here, take our gold and make this golden calf. And then they all worship it. It's absolutely insane, despite the fact they just know it was just made by a dude out of their stuff that they've just melted down. It's absolutely insane. And the problem I had with it then is it seems to just sort of suggest that actually the other gods is metaphorical, but that's never made clear. I guess that's the problem, metaphor, isn't it? So that's an idea I haven't managed to shake throughout reading the rest of it. So everything else has sort of evolved and my understanding has grown. I'm still stuck on that idea that perhaps other gods is metaphorical. I think that would just make a lot more sense, but it's just such an irritating way of putting things in poetic terms. God says again anyway that Israel's sins have been swept away and they are redeemed. So, it seems it's not an accident talking about this. And all of this is a problem for timing, isn't it? Because at this point, when Isaiah is actually alive, Israel kings are in decline. If you sort of look at a narrative arc for the Bible, it's sort of going up until the point of David, and then it's sort of dropping down from that point to the exile being the rock bottom, or at least the rock bottom to the extent I've read it so far. So they're very definitely not being redeemed at this point. It makes sense if you're looking ahead to the Babylonian exile, but Isaiah was long dead by the point of the Babylonian exile. So you're left back with that problem. Either this is a remarkable prophecy, hundreds of years in advance for something that very clearly did happen, or it's the three writers' idea, and some of it's written in Isaiah's time and some of it's written much later on after the exile. I don't think it really matters. I don't think it's worth us dwelling on it because we can't draw a conclusion from it anyway. And does it really matter? I don't think. But it is interesting in the sense that if it were real, that would be quite remarkable. But almost remarkable in the sense of the forgery, the sort of proper brazen bit of making stuff up. Let's fiddle with this and put it back in there. And I know a lot of people think that's happened with the Bible, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the important stuff hasn't. But this could be one, so that's a sort of interesting idea. It does also, though, have God stating, I bring prosperity and bring disaster. I, the Lord, do those things. Which, that's going to be a field day for atheists, isn't it? He's literally God saying he is the source of all the problems and all the rest of it, which doesn't sound very nice at all. It did also, one of the things that stuck in my head there was I come across this thing recently where it talks about the words used for God. So there's Yahweh, which is it's a little bit complicated, but most of the references to God in the Bible are using the word Yahweh, and then it's translated as Lord in the actual Bible. There's also Elohim, and I had a comment back on one of my very early videos, and someone talked about a God named El, and how the Christians had just or Christians and the Jews had just nicked this God El and said, oh, that's actually ours. But as I understand it, having researched that a bit further, the word El just refers to God, so it's not particularly a name so much as just a word for God. But the word Elohim, people talk about it's plural. So when people talk about Elohim, they're talking about a whole host of gods, which sounds a bit pagan and all the rest of it. But there's this interesting idea, because you've also got the concept coming later on that God is a God in three parts. So he's interchangeably referred to as Yahweh, just I am who I am, and Elohim being a collection of gods, but in the context of a single individual. So I don't think it's something for us to worry about just yet, but it's an interesting idea that the concept of the Trinity is actually potentially in the Old Testament by reference or by context of the references to God as Elohim being plural for gods. The other possibility, of course, is it's just stuff that was talking about lots of gods and has just been nicked and twisted. But I think the anchor for me for everything seems to come back to this resurrection idea. And if you've got the resurrection of Jesus, then all of the Old Testament makes sense because Jesus endorses it. And as talked about in the resurrection video, there's a good chance that thing does sound pretty interesting and worth taking serious anyway. But yeah, so that is that section that I got a little bit wrong. I will make sure I'm a bit more careful in future and keep them a bit shorter if I'm going to unravel huge ideas. But on we go, see what we find next.